Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff, where we are going to be tackling the last entry in the Stewart Udall sequence. And so it will involve reading that article and then taking some time to discuss some of the things in it. Now, if you remember, in episodes 1 through 5 of this series, we learned about Stewart Udall, who was a bit of a Jack Mormon in the 1960s who rose to national prominence as Secretary of the Interior under JFK. In doing so, he confronted the leadership of the church about the question of the church's teachings and policy regarding restricting priesthood and temple blessings from black members of the church, and he famously wrote a very public article denouncing those teachings and practices and calling for a change. This led to him being chastised and reprimanded by both his fellow members of the church who were defending the prophet and what they thought was right at the time, as well as apostles. Now, frequently when you talk about the issue of race and you bring up these problems, people will say, well, you are committing a fallacy. You are engaging in presentism. You're taking the understandings about race and equality that we have today, and then you're judging the past by today's standards. And so what we're going to do today is look at that question and find out, is it true that back then everybody thought the same way, and so we have no basis to be critical of church leaders for holding on to these notions? Certainly they were not unique to Mormonism, but the Mormon church in general carries a special status. And even back then, they would consider themselves to be special in status because of their claim to have the one true legitimate prophet of God who serves as the mouthpiece of God. And that position is supposed to entitle the leadership of the church to make authoritative statements on issues of importance to the human family. And one of those things that we understand now would be of utmost importance would be the value and dignity of each human soul as equal before God. And so if they fail on that standard, then it has implications about their claim. So today we're going to take a look at the next article. Let's go ahead and start. All right, again, you can find this article by going to the Thoughts on Things and Stuff website, or you can Google Stewart Udall sequence. This is entry number 6, By Their Fruits Ye Shall Know. Originally published September 24th, 2015. In this series, we have examined Jack Mormon Stewart Udall and his stand against racism in the Mormon Church. Years before the racist policies ended, he bravely and publicly condemned false doctrine which had been historically taught by church leaders. This doctrine included the concept of skin color as a marker of righteousness, or the curse of Cain or Ham, the concept of less worthy premortal spirits being born into lesser races, and the prohibition on black priesthood ordination, all of which were declared wrong by Udall a full 46 years before the church finally disavowed them in the 2013 Race and the Priesthood essay. We saw that Udall paid a price for his dissent, being lectured by both lay members and apostles who held on to those false ideas and castigated Udall for committing the great sin of contradicting church leaders. While Udall is remarkable among Mormons, there have been other individuals in history who have bravely stood up for their convictions against racism. In some cases, this stand was contradictory to the teachings of the individual's religion, and in others, it was because of their religion that they felt that such a stand was necessary. By examining a few of these brave people, we may be able to learn something about Mormonism's place in the evolution of social enlightenment on civil rights and racism. The Catholic, Homer Plessy. On June 7th, 1892, a 30-year-old shoemaker, Homer Plessy, purchased a first-class ticket for a train trip from New Orleans. He took his seat in a cab which was designated whites only. On the surface, Plessy's presence in the train was not controversial. Just 2 years earlier, Louisiana had passed the Separate Car Act, which legally required racial segregation of train car accommodations. Plessy was a socially conscious activist who believed that this law of segregation was wrong. He was involved with a social activism group which was proactive in legally challenging Jim Crow laws. Though Plessy had the appearance of a white man, his great-grandmother was from Africa, and, after taking his seat, Plessy informed the conductor of the whites-only car that he was 1/8 black. In an act that would be echoed by Rosa Parks, Plessy refused to give up his seat or remove himself from the car, and was subsequently ejected from the train, arrested, jailed overnight, and released on bond. His challenge of the law was ultimately appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and the decision in Plessy versus Ferguson upheld segregation and facilitated separate but equal laws in education and other areas around the nation. You can read more at Homer Plessy at links that are provided on the website, thoughtsonethingsandstuff.com. Here we have a copy of the ruling cover sheet for the Supreme Court in the ruling of Plessy v. Ferguson. The Presbyterian, John Marshall Harlan. The decision in Plessy v. Ferguson was not unanimous. There was a lone dissenter on the Supreme Court who did not concur that the idea of separate but equal was compatible with true equality under the law. In his great dissent, Justice John Marshall Harlan went contrary to the rest of the Supreme Court, writing, "In the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior, dominant, ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among its citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. The arbitrary separation of citizens on the basis of race while they were on a public highway is a badge of servitude wholly inconsistent with the civil freedom and the equality before the law established by the Constitution. It cannot be justified upon any legal grounds." Justice Harlan's ideas had been informed by his Christian faith. He was an active Presbyterian elder in Washington, D.C., in addition to his role as a Supreme Court justice. When the Presbyterian Church confronted the question of endorsing segregated congregations, Harlan publicly endorsed the statement of a fellow black minister. That statement read as follows: "It may not be popular, but we must stand up for principle, and there is no option left to us as Christians. Christ was not ashamed to eat with publicans and sinners, and he drew no distinction among men on account of their color. Christ died for all races. Our duty is to face the issue squarely, and we must uphold the standard Christ set up or sever our connection with him. It would be positively wrong to set up separate presbyteries within the same bounds." That's the end of that quote. Harlan went on to add that he was against separate presbyteries for whites and blacks, even if the whites and blacks were to mutually agree to have them. For Christianity has nothing to do with race, but only with men. Let us stand in the way of the fathers and say to the world that as far as our church is concerned, we are race blind and colorblind. Harlan was a surprising character to hold such a position on race. He was the son of a slave owner and became a slave owner himself when he inherited his father's slaves. Over time, however, he had evolved in his thinking on race. While he had previously supported laws based on racial divisions, he later changed his position in favor of racial equality, a decision which was met with many accusations of hypocrisy. To these criticisms, he simply responded, "I'd rather be right than consistent." You can read more about John Harlan at a series of links that are provided on the website, thoughtsonethingsandstuff.com. The Baptist, Reverend Paul Turner. Starting again, the Baptist, Reverend Paul Turner. The Plessy v. Ferguson ruling made state-imposed segregation the law of the land. For the next 50 years, while the ruling invoked the ideal of separate but equal, the reality was anything but equality. In 1954, 5 separate cases challenging the ruling were combined and heard by the Supreme Court under the heading of Brown v. Board of Education. In a unanimous 9-0 ruling, Plessy v. Ferguson was overturned, and it was acknowledged that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Communities across the nation braced for conflict as black students started to integrate into previously all-white schools in a culture still smoldering with racial tensions. One of the first high schools to integrate was located in Clinton, Tennessee, and shortly afterwards, 12 black students started to attend classes. Around this time, outside agitators arrived to fan the flames of latent bigotry. White citizen councils were formed, threats were made, and tensions grew, culminating in full-blown riots until the governor called in the National Guard to restore order. Even after the riots subsided, threats to and intimidation of the students continued. Soon it became too dangerous and too much to bear. The black students stopped attending classes and boycotted the school. Just when integration seemed hopeless, something remarkable happened. Paul Turner, the young pastor of the Clinton First Baptist Church, stepped forward and told the parents of the children that he would personally escort them to school each morning. Turner had been following the events in the community and encouraging members of his congregation to set aside their prejudice. He had met with other pastors and outlined the need for clear moral leadership in the community, but those efforts were met with a tepid response. When it became clear that no civic leadership was forthcoming and the students decided to boycott, Turner resolved to act on his own. He announced his intention to his congregation on a Sunday, and that Tuesday, the students joined Turner and a couple of colleagues as they made their way to the school. There's a photograph that was famously published at the time showing a group of black students being escorted by white men. The figure of Turner is at the back of the group in a black overcoat. He positioned himself at that location to guard against hecklers who would follow and agitate the students on their way. On their way, they were followed and jeered at by hecklers from the White Citizens Council. Pastor Turner walked at the back of the group, placing himself between the children and the agitators. His voice could be heard telling the students, "Don't be afraid, don't be afraid." As they approached the school, white students leaned out the windows yelling threats. Once the black students were inside, a group of compassionate white students escorted them to their classes. After briefly speaking with the principal, Turner left the school and began the walk to his church. Turner was promptly surrounded by the group of hecklers as he tried to make his way. "Let's kill the nigger lovers," was shouted by the crowd. Despite Turner's efforts to avoid confrontation, the hecklers became violent. They grabbed him and pinned him up against the glass plate window of a nearby building. Turner attempted to escape his attackers, but he was grabbed by his head and was bludgeoned against a nearby car. Turner's face was beaten by the leader of the group, causing Turner to fight back against his attacker. 2 police officers soon arrived, and the assault was broken up. The leader of the mob was arrested, and Turner sought medical treatment for his injuries. There's photographic documentation of some of these events or their aftermath because reporters knew that tensions were high in the area and were on site to try to document. News of Turner's bravery and beating quickly spread throughout the community. Public supporters of the protesters waned, and the citizens became more vocal in support of the rule of law. News of the event spread beyond Clinton as a national news network was present and documented many of the events of that morning. Turner was interviewed, and reporters were on hand the following Sunday when Turner delivered a sermon declaring, "There is no color line at the cross of Jesus." You can see the newscast account of Turner's ordeal, including interviews with witnesses and Turner himself, as well as a portion of his sermon in this video, which we'll play now.
Of the 4,000 people who live in Clinton, more than 3,700 are white. And by tradition and custom, most of them believe in separate schools. In 1950, Negro parents, backed by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, brought suit against the Anderson County school system, which administers Clinton High School, asking that their children be admitted. The federal judge in this section of Tennessee in 1951 and now is Robert L. Taylor of Knoxville.
The Anderson County school case was before my court about 5 years ago. At that time, I held that the colored children were not entitled to enter the Clinton High School because they were being furnished equal but separate facilities.
The Negroes appealed Judge Taylor's decision, and when the Supreme Court decision of May 1954 ruled against segregation, Judge Taylor's ruling was reversed. On January 4, 1956, he ordered Anderson County to comply. Accordingly, on August 20, 1956, approximately 700 students registered for the fall opening without incident. 12 of them were Negroes. Judge Taylor told them all to obey the law, and there seemed to be no questions. Then, another voice was heard in Clinton. An organized campaign of picketing, threats, dynamiting, and rioting had brought Clinton to the brink of anarchy. School attendance, shrunk by parents' fear of violence, was at times as low as 260. The pressure mounted on everyone: the faculty, the parents, the students. At 9 o'clock on the morning of December 4, 1956, was conceivably the darkest hour of the worst day in Clinton's history. The Reverend Paul Turner, a Baptist, was beaten up after escorting 6 Negro youths to school. Reverend Turner is 33 years old, has spent all of his life in Tennessee.
For about 5 days, these Negro students, having, of course, the legal right to attend Clinton High School, had stayed home because of harassment and hindrance and heckling and threats upon their lives and incidents that actually would make anybody scared. I chose to take such a stand on this moral principle, that as long as the law is the law, as it is in our land, and as long as they did personally choose to come to Clinton High School, their legal right, that they had a moral right to attend unheckled and unhindered and unharassed. It was this that prompted me to accompany them. Though there were quite a few hecklers, we made our way to the high school building without any overt incident. When I emerged from the school building about 5 or 10 minutes later, the hecklers were still there, and they heckled me personally. About 300 yards away from the high school, we were far away from where the policemen were doing their duty, of course, in front of the high school. One of the Citizens Council members had stationed himself with about 3 other men on a corner. As I made my way to that corner, they jumped me. I retreated across the street, Broad Street of Clinton, trying to keep him at arm's length, while the other fellows were trying to surround me and to hold my arms and to get me stationary for the beating. I retreated all the way across the street, trying to avoid any incident. Finally found myself pretty well backed up against the Bishop building on the other side of the street. I knew then that I had to do something. And it was at that time also that one man successfully held my arms down and allowed the number 1 man of their gang to land a pretty good blow upon my nose.
There were witnesses.
It was a horrible thing, and I thought they were actually killing him. Blood was streaming down his face, and even it just looked that blood was running out of his eyes. I asked someone in the group, just anyone, to help him, and when there was no response, I went to him and tried to assist him by pulling some of the men's arms from around his face. And all the time, the men in this group who were standing around were screaming, "Kill him." And that's exactly what I thought they were going to do.
It was at that time also that I realized I had to defend myself in some way, and so I took off after the man who had slugged me, pinned him against a car, and immediately about 8 to 10 people were on our backs. After a while, when the police arrived, everybody scattered pretty much. We came up from our position bending over. I took a hold of the two fellows that led the attack, one in one hand, one in the other, and shoved each of them into the arms of a policeman, and from there they took them on over to the police station. I retreated into a doctor's office.
That Sunday, with the schools still closed and the FBI still in town, Reverend Turner faced his all-white congregation for the first time since his controversial act.
The Bible is without precedent as a book, and I personally have no fear that it will ever be superseded. But many have tried to misuse the Bible, trying to justify some low standard of conduct by the very Bible that they profess to love, and by the book that never compromises with sin, with pride, with prejudice, or with hate. Billy Graham tells the following story. Shortly after the Civil War, in a very fashionable church in Richmond, Virginia, there entered a Negro man one Sunday morning when communion was being served. He walked down the aisle and took his place at the altar to partake of the elements of the Lord's Supper. There was a rustle of anger that swept through the congregation. Sensing this delicate situation, a distinguished gentleman stood up, and walking down the aisle, he took his place by his colored brother. Immediately, his magnificent example swept over the spirits of the rest of the people in that congregation, and they followed him to the altar, taking their place there too. This man was none other than Robert E. Lee. My friends, we have been too far away from God. When mobs are able in our land to flout the law, the tragic result is a Cicero, Illinois, or a Phoenix City, Alabama. Here in Clinton, we are not especially against integration. We are not especially against segregation. But we are positively and definitely against the disintegration of our community and our body politic that we cherish above all things, realizing that where anarchy prevails, none of us has anything of any value and none of us has any freedoms anymore. And now we realize more clearly than ever before that it is Christ or chaos. May we pray.
Joanne Allen's father has withdrawn her for a different reason. They're getting out.
My name is Herbert Allen, and I've lived in Clinton for 24 years. And I found it to be a nice little town to live in, very peaceful, very quiet. We never had any trouble in this little town. Thing like this happens. Sometimes we say overnight, but this thing is to be. And right now, some doesn't think it should be. But God said he created all men equal, and all men alike. And so therefore, none of us stands above the other person in God's sight. And we, as a Negro race, we are only in Clinton, Tennessee, abiding by the Supreme Court ruling that we'd send our children to the high school in Anderson County. We haven't broke any law. We hadn't went against the court ruling. And we're not leaving here with hatred in our hearts against anyone, even those who was against us. We do not hate those people because we realize that those people just misled, and they was trained and brought up that way. That's why that they were never able to understand.
Clinton High School resumed 4 days ago after the scheduled Christmas recess, with 655 students enrolled. There were no incidents. Some say that the worst is over, that although there is still little enthusiasm for desegregation, there is now a strong will to comply with the law. There are those in Clinton who say the big change came when the federal marshals and the FBI moved in. Others, among them editor Horace Wells, claim it was Reverend Turner's beating.
Another thing that has come about, as I think this is largely due to the attack on Paul Turner the other day, was that many of us had stood by, unwilling to stand up for integration, and yet also unwilling to violate the law. And when Paul Turner was attacked, the feeling of the community was more or less solidified. No mere words could have done it. It took some kind of action, a heroic action, something of this beating that was administered to Paul Turner to bring us to the point where we were willing to stand up and say, now, we are not going to put up with being pushed around anymore. We believe in law and order, and that's what we want, and that's what we're going to have. And that's the reason that the people were willing to go to Knoxville and put the matter before Federal Judge Taylor and say, now, we want this order enforced.
All right. So let's see if I can finish that. Okay. So you can read more and learn more about Paul Turner in the pages of several articles and books that are included in the article on Thoughts on Things and Stuff. Continuing with our review, the Methodist, Angie Evans. After the spectacle of Clinton in 1956, communities across the nation began to implement their own integration plans. Then came Little Rock. In September of 1957, after months of observing escalating tensions over integration, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus blocked 9 black students from entering Little Rock's Central High School. The governor had called in the National Guard to prevent violence, and this action included the soldiers blocking the black students, despite a federal court order for desegregation. One powerful photograph of black student Elizabeth Eckford being heckled by a mob of other students encapsulated the tensions of the time. The conflict continued to escalate as the federal courts did not back down in requiring the school to desegregate in the face of increasing protests, ultimately requiring President Eisenhower to call in the United States Army 101st Airborne Division to restore order and escort the students to class under armed guard. Over the next few months, tensions diminished, but the conflict lingered in the minds of Southern communities. Nearby, Van Buren, Arkansas, was one such community, and despite its Southern culture, the high school completed its first year of integration in 1957 without incident. Just 160 miles north of Little Rock, the citizens of Van Buren watched with the rest of the nation as federal forces imposed integration with military force, and many felt a sense of anger and distrust. As students enrolled for classes the following fall, these feelings manifested in protest. In September of 1958, around 60 white students staged a strike to protest the enrollment of 13 black students at Van Buren High School. A few days later, the protest escalated with burning an effigy of a black student on the flagpole of the school. It looked like the threatening protests had the desired effects. All 13 of the black students stopped attending school. For the next several days, students, parents, townspeople, and outside protesters picketed the school. Several parents and community members formed a White Citizens Council to plan a course of action. Despite what happened in Little Rock, the council didn't want integration forced upon Van Buren High School. The next school board meeting was scheduled for Tuesday, September 9th, and the White Citizens Council planned on being heard. It was at this meeting that the 15-year-old junior high school student Angie Evans would enter the picture. Jessie Angelina Evans was known to her friends as Angie. She was a very well-regarded student, having been elected as student body president at the end of her sophomore year, and she had spent the summer attending student council workshops where she learned the basics of discovering the opinions of and representing the student body. Moreover, Angie was a young woman of conscience and conviction, informed by her Christian faith as a Methodist. Several years earlier, as the Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education brought the first hints of the coming turmoil, Angie recalled the words of her Reverend Robert Sessions, affectionately remembered as Brother Bob. She recalled, "We will not be fooled by rabble-rousers or political opportunists." Let me start this again. This is her recalling the words of Brother Bob. "We will not be fooled by rabble-rousers or political opportunists who for their own selfish purposes try to stir up discord among our people. We know that the alternative to law and order is lawlessness and disorder. And the opposites of peace and love are strife and hatred. As followers of the Prince of Peace, we will work for peaceful solutions. Every experience in life that tests our faith can be an occasion for witnessing to our convictions and for examining our convictions in the light of new experience. In the days ahead, each of us will have the opportunity of bearing living testimony to the Christ-like way. This is from her remembrances in an article write-up of her story from the spring 2014 Tower Bell University periodical. You can find a link to the original article on archive.org. Angie remembered being particularly affected by Brother Bob's example of empathy and caring. Now, as her own community was facing a test of those convictions, Angie again sat in the little St. John's Methodist Church, which was next door to her home, listening to Reverend William Wilder's sermon on the Sunday prior to the school board meeting. Democracy is the rule of the majority, but it is the function of the majority to protect the rights of the minority. Moral problems are matters for the human conscience and not something to be decided by a poll of the people. That's her recollection from those sermons, again quoted from the Bell Tower article, spring 2014. Reverend Wilder imparted a concept of Christian magnanimity, Christian magnanimity that had a great impact on Angie. She would later recall learning from him that being unselfish meant more than passive sharing. It meant active giving, the seeking out of those stranded in the byways and elevating them to the first place at the table. As student body president, Angie felt a strong desire to find a way to alleviate the crisis of discrimination. Her parents had instilled in her the idea that if you try to do the right thing and do the best you can, things will work out just fine. Angie knew that the right thing meant finding a proper response to the mistreatment of her fellow students, regardless of their race. She decided to apply the skills that she had learned over the summer and polled the students of Van Buren High School about their opinions on admitting black students to enroll and attend class. Armed with this data, Angie and a few close friends decided to attend the school board meeting, though they were uncertain what to expect. Without their parents' knowledge, Angie and her friends occupied 8 of the seats in the auditorium at the school board meeting on the evening of September 9th, 1958. They listened to the proceedings, surrounded by members of the White Citizens Council. The school board was seated on the stage, listening to the White Citizens Council members make the case that they should all be taking measures to fight integration as Little Rock had done. In the midst of this debate, Angie Evans stood up and raised her hand to speak. Reporters were in attendance, and a photographer captured the moment. The members of the White Citizens Council at first saw her as a white student who probably shared their views and so encouraged her to speak. They could not have anticipated what she had to say. I think Negroes should have equal rights in all places. I think they should be allowed to go to white churches and eat in white restaurants. Negroes have a right to attend a school just as much as anybody. Angie proceeded to give the school board the results of the informal poll that she and her friends had conducted. They had polled about 160 of the school's 650 students on the question, should Negro students attend Van Buren High School? With the results showing that 28% answered in the negative, and 53% answered in the affirmative, and 19% were undecided. Speaking for the majority of the school, we think that it is only fair that the Negroes be permitted to attend this high school. If we don't object, why should anyone else? That was enough to turn the White Citizens Council against her, and they immediately began to attempt to silence the young student body president, but she would not be quiet. She then made an appeal to the conscience and empathy of the members of the White Citizens Council, asking them, have you thought what you make those Negro children feel like, running them out of school? The school board meeting soon broke up without any action being determined. Reporters had been in attendance at the meeting taking photographs and documenting the discussion, and several of them approached Angie to learn more about this remarkable young woman who bravely stood up against injustice. Yes, sir, my pastor, Reverend William Wilder, says I did right, and so does the principal of the school. Lots of teachers support me. Why did she do it? Someone had to speak up. I just don't think that segregation is a Christian thing. An account of her stand was published in Time magazine and garnered a national audience. Her story was given a front-page feature in the New York Times Herald under a title taken from Angie's own words, "Segregation Isn't Christian." Numerous other papers nationwide ran the story, and an article about her stand was published by Jet magazine to the national black readership. The impact of her bravery cannot be overstated. Less than 2 weeks later, black students returned to class and the Van Buren desegregation crisis dissolved before ever reaching the intensity that Little Rock's situation had. Angie began to receive supportive telegraphs and letters from all around the world. Many people of different faiths and nationalities congratulated and thanked her, but the attention was not all positive. She also received hate-filled letters, and her father lost customers at the grocery store he ran. Several death threats even arrived in the mail. Through it all, Angie held fast to the conviction that she had stood up for the right. Months later, she was named among Mademoiselle magazine's Women of the Year and became one of the youngest women to ever receive that honor. When reflecting upon this chapter in her life in an autobiographical essay written years later, Angie saw her stand as a response to love's injunction. Angie saw her stand as a response to love's injunction, an expression of her Christian faith, and a manifestation of the Spirit's work in her life. You can read more about Angie Evans at several of the newspaper and magazine articles and her own autobiographical essay that are linked from the article on thoughtsonthingsandstuff.com. Reflection. In each of these four examples, an individual stood for their personal convictions of brotherhood and justice against the tide of historical bigotry. In each example, it was with the support of their religious conscience that they found the courage to act. With the benefit of our modern perspective, we acknowledge the equality of race, and so we can see how each of these remarkable people were among pioneers who took important strides in bringing that enlightenment into being. What would have been the effect if each of these voices and all those who shared their views were cast out or silenced? Would that measure have promoted our enlightenment or put a stop to it altogether? Each of these individuals grew up in a religious framework. What if those in religious authority had informed them that their conscience was in conflict with the Word of God and that they should subordinate their hearts to the demands of religious authority or risk being cut off from among God's people? Would we not see that those leaders would bear some responsibility for keeping the dark stain of racism alive in the minds and hearts of the members, despite the members' own efforts to break free from the shadows of the past? Do church leaders have some responsibility for what they teach and endorse under their ecclesiastical stewardship? Then LDS apostle Spencer W. Kimball seemed to think so. Speaking in General Conference in the spring of 1971, President Kimball stated, quote, "Certainly, some blame can be attached to the voices from lecture platforms, editorial rooms, or broadcasting stands, and even from the pulpit. Such voices may have to answer for their perpetuating falsehood and their failure to give true leadership in combating evil. As with the people, so with the priest. The term priest is here used to denote all religious leaders of any faith." That's a quote from Voices of the Past, of the Present, and of the Future by Spencer W. Kimball when he was acting president of the Council of the 12 Apostles from the 1971 April General Conference. In making this point, while attempting to condemn other religious leaders, the Mormon general authorities cannot escape the implications for their own history. Homer Plessy and Justice John Harlan were standing up for equality in the 1890s. Over 50 years after that, Paul Turner suffered a brutal assault for his moral bravery. And in 1958, Angie Evans, a 15-year-old girl of Southern upbringing, felt the Spirit of God working in her as she stood up for equality. It was 9 years later that Stewart Udall bravely wrote his public letter in defiance of Mormon racist teachings, only to be rebuked and chastised by men who made the claim to speak for God. It would be 11 years later, still before the prophets at the head of the Mormon Church were able to acknowledge the simple truth that a 15-year-old girl had known 2 decades before and a Catholic shoemaker knew almost 90 years before. Lowry Nelson and Stewart Udall were both marginalized because of their appeals for equality. The letters written to Stewart Udall bear undeniable testimony to the fact that the blindness of Mormon leaders on the issue of race was transposed into the hearts of the members. Will Mormon leaders not have to answer for their perpetuating falsehood and their failure to give true leadership in combating evil, as Kimball so eloquently put it? What sort of accountability ought those leaders to bear? To many Mormons finally confronting this history, the undeniable answer is that these men can no longer claim the moral authority to declare the will of God. Churches still have practical and logistical challenges which require institutional authority and leadership, but the Mormon Church must adopt a position of religious humility which matches their historical record on important social issues. This is not a position familiar to men who have claimed the exclusive right to speak for God, and I'm not optimistic that such a change is forthcoming. Projection and mitigation. In a speech meant to explain the new position of the church in 1978, after the lifting of the ban on the priesthood, Mormon apostle Bruce R. McConkie exclaimed, "I would like to say something about the new revelation relative to the priesthood going to those of all nations and races. He, meaning Christ, who is the Lord God, inviteth them all to come unto him and partake of his goodness. And he denieth none that come unto him, black and white, bond and free, male and female. And he remembereth the heathen, and all are alike unto God, both Jew and Gentile." 2 Nephi 26:33. These words have now taken on new meaning. We've caught a new vision of their true significance. This also applies to a great number of other passages in the Revelations. Since the Lord gave this revelation on the priesthood, our understanding of many passages has expanded. Many of us never imagined or supposed that they had the extensive and broad meaning that they do have. That's from All Are Alike Unto God by Bruce R. McConkie, delivered 18 August 1978, and it can be found at byu.edu. Now, do you think that Stewart Udall, Lowry Nelson, and Jeff Nye didn't understand the importance of these passages prior to 1978? Do you think that any of the non-Mormon examples above wouldn't have seen that these passages are inconsistent with religiously sanctioned racism? The nation was well into its own awakening of racial equality decades before the Mormon prophets brought about a change. Compare McConkie's description of the Brethren's new enlightened understanding of Scripture with the 1964 statement on biblical principles on racial discrimination by the Evangelical Presbyterian Church 14 years earlier. Their statement reads as follows: "In view of the current racial crisis in our nation, we desire to give an expression of the principles of the gospel of Jesus Christ pertaining to this question. We recognize that God has created of one blood all nations of men, and therefore all nations, regardless of their color or race, national origin, are to be regarded as our neighbors, whom the Bible enjoins us to love as ourselves, as exemplified in the parable of the Good Samaritan. It makes no difference whether a man be born a Negro, Indian, Oriental, in a high or low station, rich or poor. All are creatures of God's hands and sinners in his sight, with whom there is no difference, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. We recognize that a man, regardless of his color or race, national origin, does, by faith in Christ, become our spiritual brother in Jesus Christ. Christ died that men of all nations might be saved. Whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. The believing Caucasian, Negro, Japanese, Indian, and so forth is as much in Christ and to be regarded as much in Christ as any other Christian. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither bond nor free. There is neither male nor female. For ye all are one in Christ Jesus. As Christians, we are to work towards and pray for God's richest blessing on all his people, regardless of race, national origin, or color. Realizing that there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond or free, but Christ is all and in all. From the spiritual counterpoint, therefore, no distinction exists in the Church of Christ. We feel that all our principles and actions with regard to this issue should be based upon these scriptural principles. This is from the minutes of the 1964 General Synod of the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. The Presbyterians, it seemed, were light years ahead of the Mormon prophets in the correct interpretation of Scripture. McConkie's entire speech, which I encourage you to read, is the most shameful form of revisionism, and it reeks of an embarrassed religious autocracy projecting its own blindness upon the entire membership in order to mitigate the implications of its own moral ineptitude. Presentism. Some might have claimed that we were being too harsh in our retrospective judgment of church leaders and members from the past, that we were engaging in a sort of presentism, whereby we were unfairly applying modern standards to a different age. By looking at the examples of Plessy, Harlan, Turner, and Evans, we can see that in the context of history, simple people making no special claim to divine authority lived and risked themselves for Christian principles of equality decades before Udall was chastised by Mormon apostles for advocating universal brotherhood. These individuals were providing the sort of moral courage and leadership that one would expect from God's prophets. Stewart Udall was confronted with the reality that, far from moral leadership, the Mormon prophets were using their position and authority to entrench the Mormon people in a position of racial bigotry and religious white supremacy. Conclusion. Faithful Mormons looking to provide evidence of the greatness of their religion will often cite Matthew 7:20, "By their fruits ye shall know them," and they'll point to the remarkable character of the stalwart typical Mormon, clean-cut, educated, and hardworking, with large, well-behaved families happy to give service. This image of the faithful Mormon is a simplistic caricature that does not convey the complexities of any real person's life, and likely contributes to the toxic perfectionism that leads many into depression. However, the rhetorical device of examining the fruits to determine the value of the tree can be somewhat informative. In part 1 of this series, we saw how Stewart Udall did not fit in with the faith of his upbringing. He was a fruit that had turned, and could not stay among the faithful lest he spoil the bunch. In parts 2 and 3, we saw the character of Udall manifest as he broke from the Mormon orthodoxy and publicly declared his moral principles to be in contrast to the teachings and policy of the church. The fruit of Stewart Udall was shaped by his personal conscience, not by the edicts of the brethren. In parts 4 and 5, we got a clear view of the fruit that was the product of the church. From the lowest members to the apostles themselves, this fruit tasted of bigotry, religious white supremacy, and a zealous devotion to church leaders which castigated any who would dissent. The fruit of Mormonism in the 1960s had been shaped by the teachings of church leaders. This was by design. Joseph Smith famously declared that he was able to keep such perfect orders in members of the church by teaching them correct principles, and then they govern themselves. We can see that those principles are reflected in the hearts of the apostles, men, women, and children who wrote to Udall. An honest assessment of history will inform you as to whether those principles were correct. The examples we have reviewed in this article give a glimpse of the fruits being borne by other systems of faith years before Udall's acts. These fruits were beautiful and transformative, and rather than spoiling the bunch, they had the effect of healing and purging the rotten fruits of the past. Stewart Udall was such a fruit, though cultivated by his own conscience rather than the culture and doctrine of the church. By marginalizing or excommunicating dissenting voices such as Udall's, the church denies itself the progress and healing that such ideas may provide. The story of Stewart Udall compels Mormons facing today's social issues to ask themselves, what form of fruit will your life bear? One shaped by your own conscience, or one imposed upon you by men who blindly reject love while demanding obedience to their own deficient moral authority? Afterward, I want to thank F. Ross Peterson for his original article titled "Do Not Lecture the Brethren" from the Journal of Mormon History, which first alerted me to Stewart Udall. His article is a concise account of the exchanges that we've covered in detail in the 6-part series, and you can find that article on archive.org. And that is the end of the Stewart Udall sequence. Okay, so that was a long one. Let's take a look. If you are interested in commenting, I invite you to call the show at 210-422-2222. I'm going to go ahead and set things up for that phone messages to arrive. We will allow that and go from there. And I'll stop the screen. Give me just a second while I make that transition. All right, so the number again is 210-422-2222 if you'd like to call with any comments on this. Let's see what we have in the form of viewer comments on this point. We've got someone asking, is Jane Manning James still sealed as an eternal servitor to Joseph Smith? If not, when was this sealing canceled? And can we make noise about it? That's an interesting question, and the story of Jane Manning James is one that I intend to cover in the future, so when we get to an episode dealing specifically with her life and her story, we'll take a look at that question. Let's see here. Neil Douglas says, it really is amazing to see the contrast between apostolic dogma and the humble testimony of a 15-year-old girl. I absolutely agree. That was in doing research for some of the figures in history, I came across this newspaper article about a 15-year-old girl, and I was just blown away by her simple statements of her Christian principles in the face of widespread anger and hostility over the issue of desegregation. And if you go and click on the link of the more modern article, they have a picture of her. She's still alive. And I've tried to find the reporter who originally interviewed her for that printed article. And if I'm ever fortunate enough to get a hold of her, I'd love to have her recount her own recollections of it, maybe in a video interview. But I definitely encourage you to go check it out. She also, you can see photographs of many of the letters that she received in the wake of her response. She really only shares the public positive letters. The dark, hateful letters that were threats to her were not something that she dwelled on, and so she doesn't really have those to share. But it's a remarkable story, absolutely. And I think in the case of each of these stories that were reviewed, it's just so remarkable. I think, our hearts really respond to people standing up for rightness, standing up for good in the face of evil. And I mean, when you read the Book of Mormon, a large part of the inspiration that people draw from it is the prophets depicted in the Book of Mormon standing up for right in the face of tribulation, in the face of evil. And it's very inspiring, but you can find that same emotional resonance and that same connection when you read stories of these types of people. And it's particularly jarring when the person that is sitting in the seat of King Noah listening to Abinadi, the King Noah figure is the prophet of the church, whereas the Abinadi is the Stewart Udall. Or, you can see the different faces of the opposing sides of these arguments modeled in some of the conflicts depicted in the Book of Mormon. And, that's where the Book of Mormon takes some very archetypal and classic story paradigms and builds a framework around it that is tied into your belief of it. But those things resonate with the human soul, and you can find them through all forms of literature and all forms of fiction and movies and everything. And reading these real histories of real people is very inspiring, and I found that I responded very well to them in listening and learning about them. And that's why I was so excited to be able to include them as part of this Stewart Udall series, because really, just reading about Stewart Udall and his exchange and his letter and the type of pushback that he got is inspirational, but seeing that he was simply riding the wave that the rest of the nation was, where they were really wrestling with this issue, and you can see them evolving in their thoughts and minds and realizing that the ways of the past were wrong and that progress needed to be made. Okay, so again, the phone number is 210-422-2222. I will bring that back up. That is the wrong banner. 210-422-2222. And if you'd like to call in with a comment, if we don't get any calls, we'll go ahead and shut this down shortly. The various different articles that were written in this Stewart Udall sequence, I worked on them over a course of several months, and they just became harder and harder to write as I came down, because you kind of have to dig deeper the more you go into it. But it really all started with that one article from the Journal of Mormon History about "Do Not Lecture the Brethren," and that was where somebody had just stumbled across this trove of letters in Stewart Udall's collection that showed the exchanges that they had, and it recalled to their mind the historical event. We've had, over the past several episodes, some people call in who remember the controversy over Stewart Udall when this happened. And so it's one of those moments of history, of reflection, that Mormons had that I was completely ignorant of, having grown up decade after any of those events actually happened. Okay. Let's see. Neil Douglas says, the viciousness and hubris in the response of church leaders to these people is sobering. I think particularly since we covered part 5 of the Stewart Udall series, I went back and made sure that we covered each of the other informative pieces of this whole narrative, and that is the exchange between LDS sociologist Lowry Nelson, that is the story of Jeff Nye, that is the letter sent to Mormon Governor George Romney by Apostle Delbert Stapley, and each of these bits and pieces of the puzzle give you a glimpse into the heart and mind of the apostles as they sat in their seats of power and authority, claiming to represent God and trying to pull Mormons of conscience who are trying to escape the weight of bigotry and religiously sanctioned hate that they were living under, and trying to pull them back in and tell them to get in line. And particularly in the letter that Delbert Stapley wrote to George Romney, where he's issuing tacit death threats by reminding Romney that other people who stood for civil rights were killed by assassination or by acts of God/nature. I mean, this is really ugly stuff, but that is how the apostles responded in trying to bring people into check. The other thing that I think in this story was particularly remarkable, I hadn't watched that video, the black and white video, for a couple of years since I originally published this. But I think the editor at the end, where he said, a lot of us were content to be quiet. We didn't want to make up too much of a fuss. But when the Reverend Turner stood up for the students and put himself at risk, and then found himself to be the victim of the same hatred, violence, and bigotry that was being directed towards the students, then the silent majority of the community that found the courage to stand up and to call for order and call for an end of the violence and bigotry and hate that was starting to take over the community discussion. And that type of courage becoming infectious, where one person stands up and courageously takes a stand, and it inspires other people to do the same thing, is the sort of social effect that we're seeing even in the modern day, as people start to find their own footing in standing for their own principles in the face of bigotry and hate that may be fueled by religious dogma, in the same way that these racist ideas were in the past. I mean, right now, at this moment where we're recording, you can see daily that there are protests on the campus of BYU and in other cities about changes that are being made at BYU that reflect some of these same social quandaries and the interference of religious dogma in the way that people view themselves and view those around them. All right, looks like we may have a call. Let me see if I can get this working. Hello. Okay, hold on. I got to change my audio settings. That'll work there. That'll work there. Okay. Well, it looks like they hung up right when I tried to answer it. Okay, so if you called and would like to call back, then feel free to. I'll see if I can pick up in time when that happens. Okay, so I understand that the current leaders have taught that no one knows why God commanded the leaders to ban black people from having the priesthood and celestial marriage. I must be blanking, but I can't think of other doctrines and ordinances which the leaders have not been able to explain reasons. We'll take a look at that question in a bit. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. Can you hear me? Hold on. Let's see, microphone. Hello, can you hear me? Your voice is very distant. Is there a chance you have some Bluetooth microphone on?
Yeah, better now?
A little bit better, yeah.
Yeah, well, sorry, I apologize. I am driving for work.
That's okay.
So, talking about church leadership and the patriarchy system. Oh, by the way, I'd like to say, I don't know if I have multiple. I have two cell phones here, so I can hear you on it. And I just connected my headset with the other. I do have a story. Maybe one day we can talk about it. My came from a family of grew up in the church and everything else. And by the way, I'd like to say thank you for your posts. I usually don't write much, but there's a lot of us that hear, and we appreciate the content that you put out, that kind of stuff. So
thank you.
It's very enlightening, to hear that. And so it's, and I think that you're a voice like, like so many of the other activists, and without naming names, that help us have a sort of a community, that we are able to talk, and our ability to communicate and talk about, things that we would never had a voice. I think it's important. I don't think that the church has groomed us so well. Talking about, but going back, I don't want to take too much of your time and stuff like that. But I do want to talk about my dad. He maybe this could be, something in the future that we can talk about. But my dad came from a leadership home. He made it all the way up to the quorum of the 70. He was in the fourth quorum for 7 years, I believe. And any kind of leadership calling in the church. And but specifically, I want to talk about back in the 80s when my dad was called to be, I believe, stake president for the second time or something else. And there was one member that was rather critical of the church and some of the church policies and stuff like that. Some of them, like, as far as with the report of why do the state centers have a format that also fits, in accordance with so many states and also with the wealth of the community, but yet the local wards don't. That was one thing. But anyway, that was a segue that my dad kind of got himself to think about it. And the superior to my dad at the time was Elder Harlan. He passed away. And Elder Harlan pretty much admonished my dad. He called my dad to repent. Said that it was not a place for my dad to ask questions, and that he would be looked down. It would be a report against my dad. If my dad would start asking questions, he's there to serve and serve only in the name of the Lord. So yeah. It is a culture that is very patriarchy. It is structured like a hierarchy, really. And I have talked with my dad about problems in the church, and my dad has no answer, obviously, because no one does. We all know that. But it was a way for my dad to see a side that my dad couldn't see it. If my dad, he still goes to church. We're all still, big faith, stuff like that. But there is that culture inside of the church that's dead. And the top leaders admonish the lower leaders you're here to serve. There's a very strict policy. It's not in the book, but they are taught that. The apostles tell the first quorum of the 70 will in turn keep specifically, not on emails or anything, but if you ask the stake president, he would have interviews, and this is how you deal with a rather unruly or maybe a loud bishop or an elders forum or anybody with a position of leadership that could, change the rhetoric or spin it or any of that stuff. So they do take swift action. The kids of my dad was just he just got quiet, but my dad so would my dad ever admit that this was also a fear-based, how you don't say no to callings. You will serve. And it was very interesting how a little bit of that was transcending towards the kids. My dad is a colonel in the Army. I'm not giving too much away about his situation, but he.
There are a lot of Mormon colonels in the Army.
Yes, and how this the whole the structure of hierarchy try to play into my church, to try to play into the family, and how that became rather a problem that if a child does not want to go to church, well, it's a problem because you want that image. You want that image of a perfect family, and as I hear some of the podcasts, especially some of the children of fathers that served in the high callings of the church.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of that resonated with my family. I have one brother that was never wanted to have anything to do with the church, and how my dad did not know how to deal with my brother. And it wasn't until my dad became my dad was the mission president as well for 3 years, 1992 through 95, and how my dad struggled with that, taking care of missionaries, being told literally what to do, by his area authority, and so on and so forth. But it's interesting that we teach the children free agency, but yet we are extremely flexible when it comes to our teaching. That we do not want to deal with any kind of agitation or friction from the members, and how this caused the actual problem.
Yeah.
Not accepting your son for what it is, obviously throughout, but that was my situation. How the leaders still have quite a stronghold and control over the whole hierarchy system. It's real, and I've seen it.
Yeah.
And my dad did not want me to know this, but my mom, she's. But anyway, yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I'm going to hang up so that there's a little bit of noise in the background that will interfere with it, but I'm going to respond with a few comments, and thank you for the call.
Thank you.
All right. So I know it was hard to hear that, but some of the stuff that he was talking about is having a father who was in a position of authority in the church, having risen above stake president, mission president to the level of the 70. And when questions came up and he talked with his higher authorities, raising questions, well, why do we do something this way? He's basically this is how you become educated on the culture of the church. He's told that your job is not to raise problems, to raise questions. Your job is to, and you'll hear other talks, your job is to face the members and tell them what to do, not to take messages from the members and face the brethren and inform the brethren what should be done or ask why we do certain things. And you take these little bits of stories from here and there about this being the unspoken way that the church runs, and then you think about what the natural logical conclusion is about how people rise to the ranks in church authority and leadership. If you're at one position of authority and you start asking questions or raising issues or being the problem, then that is how you are marked. And when the time comes, when a vacancy happens at the next position higher in authority, they're going to choose some other person who was a company man and never raised any questions, who only said, "How high, sir?" whenever anyone told him to jump. They're going to take that person, and that person is going to be elevated. And that type of filtering is going to happen all the way up until you get to the quorum of the 12 apostles. And so, that's why these men in those highest positions of the church have been vetted over and over and over again in order to get to that point that they will always side with the brethren. And what that means when you get in those seats around that table is that if you start out as the junior apostle, you simply parrot and agree with what the senior apostles say. And we see glimpses of that in that they are told to just kind of listen, and they need to vote and get in line and wait until they have their own seats as senior apostles before they can ever start to initiate any sort of change. And that's why the church is so far behind the rest of the world when it comes to some of these important social matters. So I appreciate your call and sharing that experience. The other thing that he mentioned is how that hierarchy of authority can interfere with our own personal family lives. Because if you take that same paradigm of compliance and authority and then you apply it in a family where the father is the head of the family and each of the children have to get in line, it can disrupt some of the normal give and take that's part of a family dynamic that allows individuals within the family to start to grow into their own lives, their own priorities, their own identities as both a member of a family and as an individual. It's a very different experience growing up in a family where you're only allowed a very narrow existence of what you can envision yourself as and still feel that you have the love and acceptance of your family, to a family that allows people the freedom to grow into who they are without those walls around them. So let's see here. Going back to the question that we had before, are there any other doctrines or issues where the leaders don't have reasons for the doctrines and ordinances? Do I know of any? Well, I know that earlier this year, President Harlan was speaking in South America, and he was explaining that, if a woman is sealed to a man and the man dies, the woman can get remarried, but is not resealed to her new husband. And if they have any children, those children would be sealed to the first husband that died already rather than to the husband who was the biological father. And then after everyone's dead, they can be sealed all together in the temple. One woman sealed to multiple men. And he said, we don't understand why. We just, that's just what it is, and God will sort it out. And so, that's at least one other example where the brethrens don't know why. But as people have observed, particularly when reflecting on President Oak's comments at the B1 celebration, where he says that, a majority of the time God does not provide reasons for his commandments, for his instructions. And so it's fraught with peril when leaders try to adventure an explanation based on their own understanding. That's a convenient get out of jail free card when those explanations were really misguided and informed primarily by bigotry and bias. But you won't find the brethren adding that caveat when they go into a doctrinal explanation on any other issue. Just General Conference is going to be coming up here in a couple of months. Just tune in and listen to all of the explanation and rationale they give over any specific church position, and you'll find plenty of it. You won't find them saying, by the way, this is just my own understanding. We don't really know because God doesn't actually provide explanations for his instructions. But that's a convenient way to try to avoid the accountability that would go along with some of the things that were done on the issue of race. So, any other comments? You can call 210-422-2222. Let's see here. Anything else? All right. Well, I think without any other calls, we'll go ahead and close it down. I've really enjoyed being able to share the Stewart Udall sequence. For me, there's a few things that really affected me in my journey out, and the issue of the history of racism in the church was a big one. There's still a handful of articles that I've written in the past on the subject of race that we did not get to cover in these few weeks where we've tried to focus on this particular subject. But we'll get a chance to do that in the future. And there's some other new things as well, such as the life of Jane Manning Janes that I'd like to cover. The other subjects that we'll have a chance to treat in the next few weeks and months will include the Council of 50 and Joseph Smith's concept of theodemocracy and exactly what that would look like. And we'll also cover some of the issues around the Nauvoo expositor. A few years ago, I issued a challenge, which was for somebody to identify something in the Nauvoo expositor, which was the newspaper published by Mormon dissidents in the 1840s, exposing a lot of Joseph Smith's secret teachings and practices, which was ultimately condemned as a public nuisance by the Nauvoo City Council, over whom Joseph Smith presided. And that newspaper, its press, and all of its copies were turned out into the streets and burned. And that act and the subsequent responses and counter-responses to it ultimately led to Joseph Smith's death at the hand of a mob. But what was actually in the Nauvoo expositor, and can we find examples of vicious lies? Because when you look at the old primary manuals intended to teach young children about what led to Joseph Smith's death, it refers to the Nauvoo expositor, and it says that vicious lies were printed in the Nauvoo expositor. And so the question is, okay, well, identify one of those vicious lies, and let's see what the expositor actually lied about. And I issued a $50 challenge for somebody to find a lie, and I got a number of responses. And in many cases, I didn't quite know what to expect, but I just started investigating based on the possible lie to see if there was any substance to the accusations made in the Nauvoo expositor. And you may be surprised to learn some aspects of what the expositor exposed and whether or not they were legitimate. So we want to cover that series as well. So without any further calls, I think we'll go ahead and close it up. And this has been Talk on Things and Stuff. Until next time.